I want you to note that I was sitting here because there's not very often has that been the case.
All right, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started now. Our speakers will take their places. So the first panel, thanks to the insights of Kevin, Roy, and Matt, was basically a view from the trenches. And we got a very, very personal perspective of both the background and the processes of peace in Northern Ireland. In this panel, we're going to see an examination of the peace process from more of an academic and outsider's perspective. Although I should say that everybody on this panel, including the moderator, have spent quite a bit of time in Ireland. As for me, when I used to teach in Boston, I ran a summer abroad program in Galway. And I did this for 7 years, spending each summer in Ireland. And after my classes were over at 11, I would take my students up to Northern Ireland. We'd go through Derry, and we would go up to the Giant's Causeway. We would go through Belfast and sometimes take the ferry across to Scotland. So those are my old stomping grounds as well. Let me tell you about the speakers on this panel. First, we're going to have Byron Bland, who is an Associate Director of the Stanford Center on Conflict and Negotiation at Stanford University. He has served on the Stanford campus for 18 years as a chaplain, and he left that post in 1994 to concentrate on peacemaking efforts in Northern Ireland. In addition to engrossing himself in those processes, for the past 20 years, he's taught an interdisciplinary course on peace at Stanford. And from that perspective, he is going to give us his insights. Next, we're going to have Bonnie Weir, who we've introduced already, but she, again, gets the credit for having this idea, knowing these people, and really putting this all together. And finally, we have Brandon O'Leary, who's the director of the Pennsylvania program in ethnic conflict at the University of Pennsylvania. He was actually born in Cork, Ireland, although he has been all over the world, being brought up in Nigeria, Sudan, and Northern Ireland. He graduated from Oxford University. His PhD was from London School of Economics, and then it was later, after winning the Robert Mackenzie Memorial Prize, which, if you don't know, is the primo prize in this area. His PhD was published as a book by Oxford University Press. He has done so many books, both in this area and in the area of peace negotiations and conflict resolution. 19 books, 125 articles. His latest book is How to Get Out of Iraq with Integrity, and people have said that it is the blueprint that the Obama administration has been using. So we're very happy to have you with us today as well. Without further ado, I turn it over to the panelists. They will each speak for 20 minutes. We will have time for about 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A. Then all the panelists will assemble together, and we'll have a 15-minute final wrap-up without a break in between.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with the kind of customary thanks to Michael and Bonnie and Calvin and everyone for making this possible. It's not only customary kind of remarks, they're deeply felt ones. I felt quite privileged to be a part of the conversations last night and to be a part of this group. But I also want to begin by expressing my deep respect I have for the first panel and many people like people on the first panel. I do believe that the real peacemakers in Northern Ireland were not the politicians. They weren't John Hume and David Trimble. They were folks, they were these folks, and there were folks like them. Many who were ex-prisoners came out of the jails back into their communities and laid the foundation for what were the later developments that lead us to where we are now. And so I want to begin by expressing my deep appreciation and respect for you and your work and the courage that you express in doing. I know some of the courage that was behind some of the things you talked about, and it's quite admirable. I want to also frame, because I have Northern Ireland and generalizable lessons, and generalizable lessons are lots of things. I mean, first off, every conflict is different. Every conflict is like some other conflicts, and so how do you separate those things? What is important about this conflict that is like other conflicts? what is important about this conflict is absolutely different from other conflicts and specific to this one. And somehow sorting that out is what we kind of academics try to do. And so I'm going to make my stab at it. There are a lot of lessons that you could generalize. Some of them you've already heard were explicit and implicit in many of the talks that were already given. The ones I want to talk about are a specific kind. And that is, in many conflicts, you know what the outcome is going to be. You've known it for some time. That's particularly true in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. That you go and ask anybody, they can tell you exactly what the settlement's going to look like if there's going to be a settlement. Now, that doesn't mean there's going to be a settlement, because people can look at it and say, well, if that's the agreement, I prefer no agreement to that agreement. But oftentimes it's the people like that agreement but can't figure out how to get there. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement is oftentimes called Sunnydale for slow learners, and many of the features of the Good Friday Agreement were present there. But the parties couldn't get there at that point even if they wanted to. And so I want to talk some about what is it that prevents people from getting to those kinds of agreements that they want to make, that are in the interest of both parties to make, but somehow they can't do, and how that might be applied. We learned it in Northern Ireland, but it might be applied in other situations, and in fact I am applying it in other situations. Bonnie asked us to begin by talking some about how we became involved in Northern Ireland. And my involvement became in the early 90s. There was a Jesuit named Brian Lennon. He showed up at Stanford for reasons that I won't tell you, and I got in charge of showing him his group around. They were from Portadown, and as these folks can tell you, whenever you see Portadown in the news, it's not good news. And so he was there, and I showed him around, and somehow or another I liked this guy. And I said, well, my center, which was not actually this center then, it was the Center for International Security and Arms Control, and I was in the ethics program there. I said, my center ought to be able to help you. And he looked right at me and said, well, what, like what? And I looked back at him and said, I haven't a clue. But if we keep talking, we might come up with something. And that began a conversation in 1971 that continues now. And we continue that conversation because it's interesting. And when it's not interesting anymore, we become drinking buddies or something. But right now, we're in conversation with one another and continue to do so. And that's what we do as a center, is in conversation with one another. In 1997, Brian was over, and we sat down and put our heads together and decided there was going to be an agreement. There was going to be agreement primarily because the two governments involved wanted there to be one. So they were going to sit the parties down at the table and say, sit there until you come up with an agreement. Now, what we didn't know whether that agreement was going to be 6 weeks down the line, 6 months down the line, 6 years down the line, or 60 years down the line. We didn't have a clue about that. But we also knew that when that agreement was reached, there weren't the relationships on the ground to sustain that agreement. And so Brian went back to Northern Ireland and drew together some of the people who were carrying on dialogue across some of the violent interfaces in Northern Ireland and formed a group called Community Dialogue. And at that point I said, well, you know, why don't we put your skilled practitioners with my researchers and see what we came up with. And so we began a kind of extended conversation that has lasted 10 years. And we structured that conversation around two sets of questions. Two questions, actually. First question was, if practitioners knew everything that researchers knew, what would they find interesting? And if researchers knew everything that practitioners knew, what would they find interesting? And if we put those two things together, I bet we'd have something interesting. And you can be the judge of that. We also focused, I want to go back to this just a second, because I like that cartoon. That cartoon was an illustration of what we were not going to do. This was not going to be a project in which there were researchers, professors of barbarian studies, and two barbarians, and we'd follow around and look at them, although there was a great deal of discussion when I would use this in Northern Ireland as to who were the barbarians and who weren't, but I'll leave that discussion aside and say that wasn't what we were about. We weren't studying anybody. What we were doing was talking with folks. We basically said, we've got some conceptual analyses, we've got some tools, you've got some experiences we're really interested in, as I explained. Let's talk. And if that's interesting to you, we'll continue that conversation as long as it's interesting to you. And so we didn't do any of this studying. I never studied anybody in Northern Ireland. I talked to people in Northern Ireland. I reflected on those conversations, but I never studied them in the way social science or political science study someone. We focused our project on dialogue and its relationship to political and social reconciliation. And the dialogue that we wanted to focus on was that dialogue that was going on in Northern Ireland. But we meant dialogue very generally. So it could be dialogue that's face-to-face. It could be dialogue that is in particular groups. It could be just general discourse in the society. It goes on in the media, in the political discussions. But dialogue in a broad sense. What's the relationship of that dialogue to the processes of political and social reconciliation? And so we first had to decide, well, what in the world are we talking about? And we decided that dialogue had to do with greater understanding. And that reconciliation, for reasons that I'm going to skip over, but if you want to go back to it, we defined that as building political partnerships. We didn't think that reconciliation meant that they had to agree. In fact, they didn't have any meaning if they did agree. But that it had to do with how do you build political partnerships with people who disagree for building a mutually beneficial future. And so that's how we defined reconciliation. When we first started, I thought they were really closely connected. I thought we'd get people together, we'd have dialogue. It was going to be dialogue about reconciliation, and we just move right ahead. Well, I got disabused of that notion fairly quickly. Because for one thing, if it was a dialogue for people who wanted there to be political and social reconciliation, they were the choir. I mean, they were already bought on to this. This wasn't hard. They were there. They wanted to do it. We'd move ahead with it. The people we wanted in dialogue were people who would sit here and say, I'm not sure that building a partnership's a good idea. I don't really believe that other side. In fact, I want to only come because I want to hear if they can really say the absurd things they say and keep a straight face. And I want to tell them what the truth is. So those were the people that we wanted to get into dialogue, not the choir. And we wanted to see whether it had any relationship to this other thing. Now, one of the things about greater understanding is greater understanding can lead to the realization that whatever sense of political partnership I thought was possible, it's much less possible than I thought. And so we had to leave that possibility open, talking about what is open-ended kind of dialogue, whether that dialogue can then help to build the foundations of some sort of political partnership. When I said that we went in there, we brought into this conversation with our partners a certain kind of framework. It's called the barriers framework, and I introduced it when I said what keeps the parties from reaching an agreement that any third party, outside party, could see would leave both parties better off. Well, if it leaves both parties better off, there's no theoretical reason. In fact, there's no practical reason why they ought to not take that step, and yet all the time they can't do it. So our analysis was about what stands in the way. I was given a 20-minute talk. If I was given a hour talk or a 2-day talk, I would tell you some of the kind of barriers and go into that kind of analysis. But let me just say that there were certain kinds of lessons that we learned in that. Some that were more important than we thought, some things that were less important than we thought, some things were just completely different. And I just want to run through them briefly because this is some of the real-world lessons that we learned. The importance of intergroup conflict. That oftentimes what's going on within the parties is what makes going on between the parties possible. That in fact, if the change in what's going on between the parties is because some change internal to the parties has taken place. That drives the process as much as the relationship across does. The importance of relationship and trust, especially in helping each side to deal with would-be spoilers. The futility of trying to convince people what they can't afford to understand. I mean, you all the time find people who are going to say, I'm going to make you understand this. Well, they're not going to understand because they can't politically, given their future and their commitments, understand what's being said. The importance of tipping points, and I want to say a little bit more about this one because this one I think is really important. And it came from some of your friends, Davy Irvin. Davy Irvin was talking to a group at Stanford, something similar in a room that looks like this, and some bright-eyed Stanford students said, would you please tell me about your conversion from violence to peace? And he wasn't buying it at all. He said, well, it wasn't really that. I became a paramilitary on Bloody Friday. I made a calculation. I had to act. The calculation was 51-49 that I'd become a bomber. But I had to act. I couldn't. When I act, I was 100% bomber. But the calculation wasn't 100% for this. It was 51-49. Later on, the situations changed, especially when I was in prison, and it tipped the other way. It became 51-49 in favor of being engaged in politics. And I became a 100% politician. So sometimes that shift is just really minor, but it can have dramatic outcomes. The importance of the transparency of loss, I'll say more about that later. The tension between the desire for peace and the demands of justice, I'll say something about that, as well as the corrosive effects of humiliation. I want to make just a few brief points about reconciliation. There's really two senses in which that term is used. The older sense was one in which a person was reconciled to the situation, reconciled to the context. No, we didn't start till 5 after. Oh, okay. I'm going to be quick then. I'm going to skip this, except to say that one of the things that we did was to, that rather than negotiations building peaceful relationships, we think that peaceful relationships make possible for successful negotiations, both the implementation, the post-conflict building, the building of political relationships. So we wanted to focus on what is building peaceful relationships. We felt that peaceful relationships were built around 4 questions. The question of a shared future. Are the parties willing to envision a future for the other side that the other side would find minimally bearable? The question of trustworthiness. How can the parties trust each other to honor their commitments? The question of loss acceptance. How can the party accept the losses that a settlement imposes so that they can make the concessions that it requires? And the question of just entitlements. How can the parties work together to alleviate the most egregious injustices? The most important one is the shared futures question. Are the parties willing to envision a future for the other side that it would find minimally bearable? Now that basically means that when I hear about your dreams and goals and aspirations for yourself, your family, and community, when I see that future emerge, I say, is there a place for me that I could bear, that I could live with? If that future that you're talking about came about, would I find a bearable place in it? I may have to grit my teeth. It may be minimally bearable, but if that future came about, I would live with it, and vice versa. So we say oftentimes that a shared vision of a future is not a shared vision of a future. Shared vision of the future is we agree. Hopefully politics can bring about a shared vision of the future. What we were concerned about was, could you lay a vision of a shared future in which each side saw that there was a place for them in the vision of the future the other side was seeking. What this does is establish a domain, a political domain, because politics depends upon my being able to lose and still have a future that I can live with. And so if I know that you can be politically successful, defeat me, and that future come about, I still have a future there. I have a place that I can live. That allows us to do politics. It also establishes a domain of trust, because if you think of trust as encapsulated interest, I trust you because I have a cognitive judgment, a perception that my interests are encapsulated in yours in such a way that when you pursue your interest, you'll further mine as well. And that's very close to what we talk about as a vision of a shared future. I'm going to be really brief now. The question of trustworthiness is, how can the parties trust each other to honor their commitments? How can they demonstrate through word and deed that something has changed? Because for all along up until this point, they said they were going to make, they are now willing to do what they previously said they couldn't do, would under no circumstances would do. So why would I trust you? And the most important one of these things is agreements that mask disagreements, which is a kind of problems that have to, how do you get from here to there, which is what really this question of trustworthiness is about. Agreements, in every agreement that is made, it is an agreement that masks disagreement. So we agree about these, but there are fundamental disagreements that we still disagree about. And so the question is, in many ways, how can you use the things that you agree about to begin to address the things that you still disagree about? And that's what I see both the Good Friday Agreement, the St. Andrews Agreement, every political agreement, every agreement that the Belfast City Council makes is a political agreement, is an agreement that masks fundamental disagreements. And it then becomes the context in which you try to work those things out. 3 observations. Every negotiated agreement imposes losses and injustices on the parties, often unequally. It's just the nature of a negotiated agreement. You didn't win. You don't get all you want. It's going to impose losses that you don't think are justified. It's going to impose injustices on you that you don't think are justified. It's going to happen that way. That's part of the and they're not, in most hard situations, not equal. If they were equal, that'd be a different thing. That would be easy. In most hard conflicts, they're not imposed equally on the parties. How do you deal with that? There are deep asymmetries which make reciprocity a problem. That's the way human beings deal with things. You trade things of equal value. Most serious conflicts don't have those trades available to the parties. If they did, it'd be easier to solve the problem. There's also humiliation, powerlessness, and loss and injustice. Those play factors that are often ignored by academics and negotiators, and yet they play critical elements in this. It's oftentimes hard to deal directly with humiliation and powerlessness. I can tell you don't be humiliated. I can tell you get more power. That doesn't really help you. So we tried to fold those things into questions about loss and injustices. I'm hopping along. The question of loss acceptance. How can the parties accept the losses that a settlement imposes so they can make the concession that it requires? I think this is important. Both sides will feel that the settlement requires real and painful concessions from them and gives them little of significance in return. That the settlement requires no meaningful concession from the other sides and gives them everything is important. And so how do you deal with that? Since basically it's based in the fact of I don't think you had any legitimate claims on the things that you're giving up. So that begins the process of making concessions, where you feel those are painful concessions that you make to one another. What we think is that each side gains a greater appreciation of the cost that the other side is willing to bear in order to reach an agreement. So if I begin to understand what you've given up in order to live in peace, it makes me more likely to be willing to make those concessions. And that comes through dialogue as well as understanding. Finally, the question of just entitlements. How can the parties work together to alleviate the most egregious injustices? That's the buzzsaw. The buzzsaw is that the agreement has to be minimally just in order to have it any legitimacy, and yet justice is a barrier to the reaching of conflicts. What we do is we don't really think that anybody in an existential sense asks them that question, is this a fair agreement? What they ask themselves, we think, is are the injustices that this situation places on me worth bearing for the benefits of the calm? And the parties have to make that answer be yes, so that the calm is worth enduring the injustices because of the benefits I get. That's the question I think I asked myself at Stanford. It's what the question I think many people ask themselves here. It's what the question the people in the West Bank ask themselves. The answers to that are very different. But we nevertheless think that's the thing. And the way you can deal with it is say, how can we work together to lessen the injustices that the agreement is going to pose on the parties? We have to work together to do that. We can't alleviate it. We're not going to agree about what justice is, but we can work to agree with what are the greatest injustices and how can we work together to alleviate them. I'm not going to do that one. And so now I'm going to leave you with the conclusion. It'd be my preference that you think that the Nobel Peace Prize is on the way, it's in the mail, but it's probably more likely you'd say if it made sense, this would be a powerful idea.
Bonnie, and do you have a PowerPoint?
Should be on there. Okay. Okay, so I think my presentation will be slightly different from that of Byron. Happily, just I think I have a bit of a different focus. Why did I become interested in Northern Ireland in the first place? At first, I was, I think, very much in narrow-minded academic mode. And I thought mostly about very abstract conceptual questions, such as the conflict of interest within groups of people who share the same broad political goals. I had in mind something like Kevin and Matt. I also thought about how it was remarkable that a very large movement that used armed force made such a successful, if transformation is an appropriate word to use, transformation from a conflict that most observers almost universally thought was intractable at the time. I was also interested in the fact that in Northern Ireland you saw a variation in the type of non-state groups' use of violence, specifically in the type of targets that they chose, their use of brutality, and their organizational structure or tendency to fracture. And then I became quite preoccupied and I might say a bit disillusioned with the problems in the study of conflict and settlement in social science and particularly in political science. I feel that there's both conceptual flaws and methodological mistakes as we approach some questions in the study of conflict, particularly that of insurgency or terrorism. So with current methods or approaches, I think that scholars have made the most advances in areas where they conduct projects, for instance, quantifying traits of suicide bombers. Now, suicide bombing constitutes less than 1% of all terrorism in the history of political violence. So this is a very unique category. And I don't think that we can easily extrapolate from that what kind of people join groups that use political violence or use force and are politically motivated, and then try to infer as well why they may stop or change strategies. More conceptually, the concept of civil war versus civil conflict misses the point of, I think, characterizing how serious a conflict is in the first place, because as you might see from this map, and hopefully it will, the animation will be quick enough, but these are all names of those people who were killed during the Troubles, and I think that by the approaches that we take, we don't appreciate how personal conflict ends up being to a society that is permeated by tragic and violent human division. So that is something that I've been preoccupied with methodologically and conceptually for some time now. So what did I decide to do? Well, I spun my wheels for probably way too long, and then I finally decided to look at some of the factors that prominent scholars have examined when it comes to the question of civil conflict, and particularly economic opportunities and repression by either a government or proxy forces at individual and local levels. Basically, I think that we need more personal stories and an understanding of the variation that occurs at individual levels, because people join groups for different reasons, and people decide to put down the gun for different reasons as well. And it may be a complex question, but not one that we necessarily cannot answer. So I wanted to begin to talk to a broad sample of people on all sides of conflict and peacemaking. So then I am moving on to the question of the experiences that I've had in Northern Ireland as far as it concerns divisions between like-minded people. And I've just listed some quotes here, and I think I'll omit reading some of them, but I think maybe the last one might be the most helpful. Jerry Adams, the former IRA leader and president of Sinn Féin, once said, "We in Sinn Féin were more the enemy than the British and the Unionists for some of the SDLP leadership." So I think that that was something that interested me a great deal conceptually, and that I tried to explore at an individual level with people whom I interviewed. Moving on to different types of government repression and the type of impact that that might have on different individuals in different circumstances. I like both of these quotes. I think that there's a great difference between people who experienced the conflict in Belfast and the people who experienced the conflict in Derry, or some might call it Londonderry. The first quote says, "I got released from Long Kesh. Things were pretty bad when I got out. The Loyalists were shooting Catholics left, right, and center, and I lived in a Protestant area and was really vulnerable to attack." So there was much more of a focus in my field work when I spoke with people from Belfast on the problem of feeling that they were being persecuted by their sectarian neighbor. On the other hand, and in opposition to this, Mairead, and I've changed both of these names to preserve anonymity, a resident of Derry, talked extensively about the British Army and the RUC and how they were the best recruiting agents for the IRA. So Derry seemed as if it were much more of a city in which the fight was between the Irish and the British, and not necessarily between Catholic and Protestant neighbors that were living in a patchwork. This is something that I think that Kevin mentioned during his presentation, and I think it is terribly important that paramilitary leadership is able to demonstrate to government negotiators that they have an ability and a willingness to control the rank and file. So, for instance, I'll read just the last quote. The most important people to convince that the Good Friday Agreement should be accepted were the activists or the volunteer members of the IRA, because they had sacrificed the most and they had moral sway over potential new activists. So, and there was also an episode, I know, where the British government was contemplating accepting an offer by the IRA to go on a ceasefire, although I think they did not use that term, and they were quite worried about whether or not the message was both genuine and that the leaders of the IRA would be able to, in fact, carry it out. This is an area that I think, like Byron, I am very much preoccupied with, the question of personal trust. I think that social scientists, and particularly in political science, we're not very well equipped to handle this question of what is trust and what does it mean in circumstances of conflict and potential settlement. So I think that all three of these quotes are very good illustrations of how important trust is, especially when the stakes are so high. Actually, one day I joked with students, and I think I might have scared them, that if they got a question wrong on their paper, what if they had lost a finger for each time they got something wrong? And I think that would make people a lot more careful. And I think just putting yourself in that position for a moment makes you realize that the decisions that we make in life in absence of great conflict are much easier to make because they have much less dire consequences potentially. So one Irish civil servant said, yes, I was chosen to work with a group toward its decommissioning because it was obvious I got on best with them in that group out of everyone. Another respondent, a senior Republican activist, said, I did not want any document proposing a way forward that is toward peace, change in strategy, to be attributed to me, because if you propose an idea that would not be acceptable, well, and he made a motion of a gun or a bullet going into his ear. So in that environment, I'm sure one can imagine how important personal trust is. John Chilcott, who was working for the Northern Ireland office during the time of the peace process, commented on the need for a Republican ceasefire that was much more extensive than one that was on offer, because he said some great gesture was necessary, because the leap from Republican politicians from former terrorists was a big gap to judge across. So again, trust was key to any change there. So the key preliminary findings that I've come up with so far really focus on local and individual factors being crucial in not only the intensity of violence over time in civil conflicts or insurgencies, but potential settlement or political transformation of armed groups. And the specific local and individual factors of importance that I've identified so far through mostly speaking with people, but then trying to find also some quantitative evidence to support it as well, is that conflict within political communities themselves is important, because it can either increase or decrease the coherence of a group that is negotiating with a government, which relates to if you skip over the next one, the leadership's ability to control the rank and file and volunteer paramilitary organizations or groups. This is I think, probably the foremost concern of any government representative that is negotiating with potentially mainstream groups that are still engaged in the use of force. Different types of government repression in different areas, I think, truly affect the level of animosity that people might have toward a government or toward their view of the enemy, and may make them more or less predisposed to sitting down in dialogue. And then again, to reiterate personal trust, especially at moments of potential strategic change, because those are moments of extremely high risk and extremely high stakes. So this would just be to briefly illustrate that local conditions differed quite a bit, even when you examine some of the main factors that predominant scholars tend to look at when they're studying the tendency to engage in violence or to settle politically. So although you see that in the Armagh, on the left in red, Armagh, Belfast, and Derry districts from 71, 81 to 91, that trends in unemployment were similar in these three areas. But at the same time, the trends in the Republican use of force were not similar in those same districts. And this is preliminary evidence. Also, now this I think is something that I've been increasingly focusing on, is the difference between the experience of people living through the conflict in Belfast versus in Derry. The blue indicates deaths or the percentage of deaths that were caused by British forces, and the orange represents the percentage of deaths caused by Loyalists. And you'll see on the left three columns are Belfast from 72 to 81, 82 to 91, and 92 to 2001, and those same years on the right for Derry. And you can see that British forces were much more active and much more deadly in Derry than were Loyalists, and the opposite was true in Belfast. So just to briefly wrap up, I've taken a preliminary look at violent movements elsewhere, and particularly in democracies where there is a potential for political participation. And just over 90% of such movements, and this is only from the years 1999 to 2002, are either partly or entirely represented by at least one conventional organization, which means this is not trivial. It means that the potential for political transformation is there, and that also armed opposition movements or armed groups are not monolithic, but are rather characterized by greater or lesser degrees of internal division. Finally, what I would say when it comes to understanding what happened at the end of the Troubles and perhaps what facilitated agreement was that dialogue and a willingness to just sit down at the beginning was crucial in the initial momentum toward the peace agreement. And there's been a recent Supreme Court ruling in late June of this year, Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project. And the ruling held that any, quote, material support of a foreign terrorist group, including talking to terrorists or the communication of expert knowledge and scientific information, helps lend legitimacy to the organization. And I think that this is something that hasn't received enough attention. I'm not a legal expert, but I do think that it will hamstring political, civil, and military leaders if they see an opening for dialogue with violent groups that may be seeking to give up the use of force. And at the same time, it gives no incentive to such groups to feel that a change to their strategy or engaging in talks will be worth their while. So I think that this is actually, if we say that the age after September 11th, we're living in a new world and we're fighting a global war on terror, that this is one of the most unfortunate and possibly destructive developments to occur depending on how it's implemented in American foreign policy. So that is my take on the Good Friday Agreement and its implications for conflicts elsewhere.